Every Christian tradition insists the four Gospels agree on the essentials. But read all four in parallel, and one thing becomes unmistakable. John isn't the fourth Gospel. It's a replacement, and that is precisely what has been hidden from every Sunday school classroom. Now listen carefully. I want to be precise about what I mean by that word, replacement. I am not using it loosely. I am not trying to be provocative for the sake of it. I mean it in the structural sense that a careful reader of these texts eventually cannot avoid. Because once you place the four Gospels side by side, not harmonized, not filtered through centuries of theological commentary, but read as four separate documents with four separate authors who each had a purpose, a pattern becomes visible that 19 centuries of institutional Christianity has had every reason to minimize. The standard teaching runs something like this: Matthew, Mark, Luke, the Synoptics, broadly harmonizing accounts, sharing sources, overlapping in material. And then John, the spiritual gospel, the theological gospel, the one that dwells on the inner life of Jesus rather than external events. Complementary. Deepening. The fourth witness who adds what the others could not fully express. Baruch Spinoza did not accept that framing. And what I want to walk through with you today is why he was right not to. In his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, published in 1670 anonymously, because the consequences of publishing it under his name were obvious, Spinoza laid out a method that was genuinely radical for its time. He asked 3 questions about any biblical text. Who wrote it? For whom was it written? And when? Not as an act of disrespect, as an act of intellectual honesty. When you ask all 3 of those questions about the Gospel of John, something comes into focus that the harmonizing tradition has worked very hard to keep out of focus. I should say something about method before we go further, because I think it matters. What Spinoza gave us is not a hammer to destroy faith, it is a lens. The question is whether you are willing to pick it up and look through it. Some people are not, I understand that. But if you are watching this, I suspect you are at least curious. And curiosity, genuine curiosity about what these texts actually are, is not the enemy of serious engagement with them. It is a precondition for it. What I found, working through this material over many years, was something I initially resisted, something I tried to explain away. I want to be honest about that, because the strongest argument I can make to you today is not the argument of someone who came to this with a conclusion already in hand. It is the argument of someone who kept finding the same evidence no matter which direction he approached it from. And it starts with a dead man. A very specifically dead man. A man who had been in a tomb for 4 days. Right. Lazarus of Bethany, John chapter 11. If you know the New Testament at all, you know this story. Jesus arrives after Lazarus has died. Martha and Mary, his sisters, are grieving. Jesus goes to the tomb, calls Lazarus out, and Lazarus emerges, still wrapped in burial cloths, 4 days dead by the text's own account. A public miracle, witnessed by a crowd, in the village close to Jerusalem, with mourners who had come specifically from the city. This is not a quiet healing. It is the most dramatic resurrection narrative in the entire New Testament, short of the Easter event itself. And this is where I need you to hold 2 things in your mind at the same time. The first, in John's Gospel, the raising of Lazarus is the direct cause of the decision to kill Jesus, not a contributing factor, the direct cause. John chapter 11, verses 47 through 53. The chief priests and Pharisees convene a council. They say explicitly that this man is performing too many signs, that if they leave him alone, everyone will believe in him. And then Caiaphas, the high priest, says that it is better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. And from that moment, John tells us, they planned to kill him. The death of Jesus, in John's account, is set in motion by the raising of Lazarus. That is not a minor plot detail. That is the load-bearing structure of the entire second half of the Gospel. Now, Matthew's Gospel. A detailed narrative of the final week in Jerusalem, the entry, the confrontations, the Last Supper, the trial, the crucifixion. Lazarus, not mentioned, not once. Mark's Gospel, the earliest Gospel, the source that Matthew and Luke both drew on. according to the overwhelming consensus of New Testament scholarship. The final week, Lazarus is not there. Not a reference, not an echo, nothing. Luke's Gospel, which has its own independent sources, which records healings and miracles found nowhere else, which includes a parable involving a character named Lazarus, a different Lazarus in a parable, not a resurrection story, but the name is there. And yet the actual raising of Lazarus of Bethany absent. I want to pause here because the harmonizing defense deserves to be heard fairly before it is examined. The standard response is, the gospel writers made editorial choices. They could not include everything. Mark is the shortest gospel. Matthew and Luke selected from what they knew. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. This is a reasonable position. In many contexts, it is the right instinct, except 3 independent sources. Matthew drawing on Mark, but also on his own material. Luke drawing on independent sources. All 3 writing accounts of the final week that include the motivation for the authorities' hostility toward Jesus. And all 3 find that motivation somewhere other than Lazarus, in the temple confrontation, in the accumulated pressure of an increasingly popular teacher who was challenging institutional authority. None of them used the event that John says was the trigger, an event involving a named family in a named village close to Jerusalem, involving a crowd of witnesses in the days immediately before the arrest. The argument from silence works when we have one source that omits something. When we have 3 independent sources that all omit the same thing, something that would have been, by John's own account, the most dramatic and consequential single event of Jesus' public ministry, we are no longer in the territory of editorial selection. We are in the territory of narrative creation. The silence of Matthew, Mark, and Luke about the raising of Lazarus is the strongest single historical argument that this episode was not a shared memory of what happened. It was constructed to serve a theological function, to make Jesus the explicit cause of his own death, to make the resurrection the thing that triggers the crucifixion, and thereby to weave the themes of death and resurrection into the very architecture of the story before Easter even arrives. Perhaps you might say they simply chose not to include it. It was too dramatic, too much. Except that doesn't hold either, because each of the 3 synoptics does include other dramatic miracles. The healing of the blind man, the raising of Jairus' daughter in Mark and Luke. The selection principle doesn't explain why this one in particular was set aside by all 3. And the location matters. Bethany is not Galilee. It is 2 miles from Jerusalem. The synoptics are not vague about what happened in Bethany. They record Jesus staying there during the final week. They record the anointing at Bethany. The location is present in their accounts. The miracle is not. That might be enough on its own. But Lazarus is only the beginning, because what I'm going to show you about the crucifixion date is the kind of detail that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Now listen carefully to the sequence I'm about to give you, because the precision matters. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Last Supper is a Passover meal. Jesus and the disciples gather on the evening of the 14th of Nisan, which is also the start of the 15th, because in the Jewish reckoning the day begins at sundown. The meal they share is the Passover Seder. The crucifixion happens the following day, the 15th of Nisan, the first day of Passover itself. In John, the sequence is different. John chapter 13, verse 1, before the Passover festival. The Last Supper in John is not the Passover meal. It is a meal on the evening before Passover. And then, this is the verse I need you to note. John chapter 19, verse 14. The trial before Pilate. John writes, "It was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about the 6th hour." The crucifixion in John happens on the 14th of Nisan, the day of preparation. The day when, in the temple courts, the Passover lambs were being slaughtered. I want to give you the exact verse where John reveals its own hand. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. Cole, writing in the mid-50s, a decade or 2 before any gospel was committed to writing, says Christ our paschal lamb has been sacrificed. The Greek is to pascha hemon etou te Christos. Our Passover has been sacrificed. Paul is using the Passover lamb as a metaphor for Jesus. But in John it is not a metaphor. It is a chronological fact. John has restructured the timeline so that Jesus dies at the precise moment The Passover lambs are being killed in the temple, not as a literary flourish, as a theological argument that required the chronology to be arranged accordingly. This is not a minor discrepancy. Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree. Jesus ate the Passover and was crucified the following day. John. Jesus died on the day of preparation, while the lambs were being slaughtered. These two chronologies cannot both be historically accurate. One day separates them, and that one day carries the entire theological weight of John's Christology. Jesus, as the Passover lamb, slain at the appointed hour, is not a metaphor in John. It is the point, and making it the point required John to move the crucifixion back by 24 hours. I came to understand this not through reading initially. I came to understand it through watching a student understand it. It was autumn 2003, a seminar room in Norwich, the kind of room that had absorbed decades of similar conversations, radiators that knocked and hissed without providing much warmth, chairs arranged in a rough oval, 8 or 9 students. Second-year undergraduates working through Synoptic problem material, and I had introduced a section on John's relationship to the Synoptics, which at that point in the course felt relatively uncontroversial. A student in the second row, I have forgotten her name, which I regret because I have thought about her several times since, was reading rather than listening. She had a small notebook, the kind with a dark cover, and she wrote in a careful hand that suggested someone who had been taught to take notes properly. At some point she stopped writing. She was holding her pen but not moving it. She looked up not at me but at the middle distance, the expression you see when someone is trying to hold two things in their mind simultaneously and finding they won't fit together. She said, "But that means one of them is wrong about the date." And the room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone has said something that everyone else was also thinking but had not said. I gave the standard harmonizing response. Scholars have proposed various reconciliations. The Synoptics may be working from a different calendar. There are ways of reading the Johannine account that soften the contradiction. The essential theological content is consistent across all 4 accounts. This is what the curriculum required. She wrote it down, carefully in that small notebook. She did not look satisfied. She looked the way you look when a text has let you down. Not outraged, not triumphant, but genuinely disappointed, as if she had expected better. I went back to my office afterward. There was a cup of tea I had made before the seminar, gone cold on the desk. Papers to mark. I could not start them. I sat in that office for longer than I should have, and thought about the question she had asked, which was simply the right question, the one the harmonizing tradition exists precisely to deflect. One of them is wrong about the date, and the answer, if you follow the evidence rather than the institution, is yes. And the reason one of them is wrong about the date is not accident. It is theology. She may have gone on to investigate further on her own. I hope she did. In a moment I will show you the structural counterpart to this, the precise place where John's rearrangement of events reveals the architecture of replacement rather than complement. And this is where it becomes structural, not just a different memory, but a different architecture. In Mark's Gospel, and Matthew follows Mark here, the cleansing of the temple happens during the final week. Jesus enters Jerusalem on what we call Palm Sunday. The following day, he enters the temple and overturns the tables of the money changers and the seats of those selling doves. Mark chapter 11, verse 18. When the chief priests and scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him. In Mark, the temple incident is the immediate trigger. It happens in the final week. It is the match that ignites the powder. In John, the cleansing of the temple is in chapter 2. Chapter 2. This is the beginning of the public ministry. Jesus has just attended a wedding in Cana of Galilee. He has turned water into wine. He arrives in Jerusalem for Passover and clears the temple. Same overturned tables, same doves, same cord of whips. But this happens at the very start, perhaps 3 years before the crucifixion, according to John's own timeline. Now consider the problem this creates. If John's sequence is correct, the temple authorities witnessed Jesus clear the temple at the beginning of his ministry and presumably tolerated everything that followed for 3 years. They watched him heal the sick, multiply loaves, raise Lazarus publicly 2 miles from Jerusalem. And the thing that finally motivated them to act was Lazarus. John has removed the temple incident as the immediate trigger and replaced it with Lazarus. But in doing so, John has created a narrative problem. Why did the temple authorities wait? Why did they tolerate an escalating public ministry for years, including a dramatic public miracle in their immediate vicinity, without acting until Lazarus? Perhaps John placed the temple incident at the beginning to establish the conflict early, to show that the opposition was always there, always latent. This is the harmonizing argument, and it has a certain coherence to it. Except that John also gives a completely different reason for why Jesus is killed. He doesn't give us the temple as the proximate cause. He gives us Lazarus. He gives us the Sanhedrin's explicit deliberation after the resurrection miracle. And once you hold that substitution in your mind, temple moved to the beginning, Lazarus installed as the trigger, you cannot read it as editorial variation. You are looking at architectural redesign. January, early 2000s, an ordination college in Norfolk, not a university, not a secular academic institution, but a college specifically preparing candidates for ordained ministry in the Church of England. I had been invited to contribute to a study day on Johannine scholarship, not because I was a regular presence there, but because someone had read a paper I had written on chronological transposition in the gospel narratives and thought it might be useful context for their students. Marcus Borg was on the bibliography. That should have told me something. The morning was cold in the specific way of institutional buildings that are too large to heat properly, the kind of cold that has accumulated over decades. We were in a meeting room off the main corridor, perhaps 12 candidates for ministry, somewhere in their late 20s and 30s, sitting around a rectangular table. The paper I gave was careful. I had framed it academically, hedged the claims, used the standard scholarly vocabulary of source criticism and redaction criticism. I was not trying to disturb anyone's faith. I was trying to describe what the texts say. After the session, as people were gathering coats and papers, the director of the college, an intelligent man, quietly authoritative, the sort of person who chooses words very deliberately, asked if I had a moment. We stood in the corridor. He was not hostile, he was not rude. He was, in the specific way that institutions sometimes are, absolutely clear. He said in so many words that the questions I was raising might be more at home in a university setting than in a college with our particular purpose. I was not invited back. I drove home on grey Norfolk roads with the radio off, and what I felt, this is the thing I want to be precise about because I have thought about it many times since, was not anger. I understand why a college preparing people for ministry cannot spend its time undermining the foundations of what those people are being prepared to affirm. That has its own logic. What I felt was something more unsettling. I felt the particular texture of having been told that the question itself was the problem. Not the answer I had given, not the way I had presented the material, the question. The act of noticing that the temple appears in two different places with two different functions and that this matters. That noticing, the noticing itself, was what could not be accommodated. I want to be careful here, because what I am about to say about the language of John's Gospel, if you sit with it long enough, reorganizes how you read every Gospel. Not just John, all of them. In Mark's Gospel, and this is a well-established observation in New Testament scholarship, not a fringe claim, Jesus repeatedly tells people not to speak about what he has done. Heals a leper in chapter 1. See that you say nothing to anyone. Raises Jairus' daughter, strictly ordered that no one should know. At Caesarea Philippi, when Peter identifies him as the Messiah, sternly ordered them not to tell anyone. This is what scholars call the messianic secret. Whatever the historical explanation for it, the literary function in Mark is clear. Jesus avoids explicit self-proclamation. He does not announce who he is. The announcement is indirect, enacted through deeds, eventually confirmed through the resurrection. But the Jesus of Mark does not stand up and tell people about himself in the first person with philosophical elaboration. In John, Jesus gives 7 extended declarations about his own identity. Not healed someone and told them to be quiet about it. Formal first-person declarations. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way and the truth and the life. I am the true vine. 7 statements, each with a predicate that positions Jesus within a cosmological framework, each one a claim that would have been unmistakably clear to a Greek-speaking audience familiar with philosophical and religious literature. And then, the most explosive of all, John chapter 8, verse 58, the controversy about Abraham. The opponents say to Jesus, "You are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham." And Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." The Greek is prin Abraham genestai ego eimi, I am, the divine name. Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, God said to Moses, "I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you." John has Jesus use the divine name in first-person form in the middle of a temple courtyard. His opponents immediately pick up stones. This is not the Jesus of Mark. This is not even close to the Jesus of Mark. It is not a matter of emphasis or of dwelling more on the interior life. It is a categorically different self-presentation. The Jesus of Mark avoids self-proclamation. The Jesus of John makes statements that, in the Jewish theological context, constitute blasphemy on their face, which is precisely why John's opponents reach for stones. Consider also what is entirely absent from John: parables. The Synoptic tradition contains more than 40 parables: the mustard seed, the prodigal son, the sower, the good Samaritan, the workers in the vineyard. This is the teaching style that characterizes Jesus in 3 independent Gospels. In John there are no parables, not one. There are extended discourses, allegories, metaphorical passages, but the parabolic form, the characteristic mode of Jesus' teaching in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is absent from John entirely. Now we arrive at the prologue. John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. The language here, and this is the argument I find it impossible to dismiss, did not come from Galilee. The concept of the Logos as a mediating divine principle between the transcendent God and the created world is Stoic philosophy adapted through Hellenistic Judaism. It is the vocabulary of Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher writing in Greek in the 1st century. Philo uses Logos extensively to describe the divine reason that structures creation, the intermediary between the ineffable God and the material world. Philo was not writing in Aramaic. He was not writing for a Galilean fishing community. He was writing for educated, Greek-speaking Jews navigating the intersection of their tradition and Hellenistic philosophy. And the author of John's prologue was drawing on exactly that tradition. This is not the opening of Matthew, genealogy, Abraham, David, the birth narrative rooted in Jewish messianic expectation. This is cosmological theology, in the philosophical mode of Alexandria. 3 pieces remain, and one of them will reorganize everything. The word I need you to remember is aposynagogus. It is a Greek word. It appears 3 times in the New Testament, all 3 times in the Gospel of John, and it appears nowhere else in ancient Greek literature outside of texts related to early Christianity. John chapter 9, verse 22. The Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue, aposynagogos. John chapter 12, verse 42. Many even of the authorities believed in him, but because of the Pharisees they did not confess it, for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue. John chapter 16, verse 2. They will put you out of the synagogues. 3 references to formal exclusion from the synagogue as an imminent threat to the disciples of Jesus, people who, in the story's timeline, are living in Galilee and Jerusalem in the early 30s of the 1st century. But here is the problem. Formal institutionalized exclusion from the synagogue as a disciplinary practice. The Birkat HaMinim, the benediction against heretics included in synagogue prayer specifically to identify and exclude Jewish Christians. This practice developed in the decades following the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The scholarly consensus places its crystallization in the 80s and 90s. John scholar J. Louis Martin made this argument systematically in 1978, and it has become foundational to understanding the Johannine context. The references to aposynagogos in John reflect the experience of the Johannine community, the specific group of Jewish Christians who produced this gospel, not the historical experience of Jesus' disciples in 33 AD. John is projecting backward. The fear that runs through those 3 verses, the fear of being cast out of the synagogue, of losing your community, your social identity, your religious home, that is the lived experience of a community writing in the 80s or 90s, not the experience of fishermen from Galilee. The text is transparent about its own context if you know what to look for. And consider how John speaks of the Jews, hoi Judaioi in the Greek, throughout the Gospel. In Matthew, the opponents are chief priests, Pharisees, scribes, specific groups within Jewish society, named and particularized. In John, the opposition comes from the Jews as a collective entity repeatedly in over 70 passages. This is not the language of an internal Jewish debate. This is the language of a community that has already undergone a rupture from the synagogue, that has been excluded from a home it once shared, and whose anger and grief at that exclusion has been folded back into the narrative of Jesus' life. The Jews in John are not the majority Jewish population among whom Jesus lived. They are the institutional body that, from the perspective of a community writing decades later, had expelled them. If you are someone for whom these texts are the foundation of a faith you hold seriously, what I'm about to say is not a reason to abandon that faith, but it is a reason to understand what you are actually holding. The Gospel of John may have sustained more individual human beings through grief and uncertainty than any other document in Western civilization. Its language has found its way into the interior lives of people who would never have heard of Philo of Alexandria, or Messianic secrets, or Synoptic source criticism. That weight is real. It does not disappear because we understand the text more precisely. There is one more thing, something sitting in the final pages of John's Gospel that most readers walk past without noticing. A seam in the text. I went to Cambridge to look at it properly. I had gone to the Cambridge University Library for another reason entirely, checking a reference in Josephus for something I was writing about first-century Judea. The University Library in Cambridge has that quality of accumulated intellectual seriousness that makes you lower your voice without being asked. Tall stacks, light that filters in without quite illuminating anything fully, the sound of pages turning somewhere in the distance. I asked to see a facsimile of the Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest complete manuscripts of the New Testament, 4th century, now in the Vatican Library, available in facsimile reproduction for consultation. The librarian, a specialist who clearly knew the text well, set it out and then also brought, unprompted, a critical edition with the textual apparatus, the scholarly notes recording where different manuscript traditions diverge. I turned to the end of John's Gospel, chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. This is a formal closing statement, a declaration of purpose. The author announces why the book was written. This is how you end a document. I followed the apparatus. Multiple manuscript traditions end precisely here. There is textual evidence that this was, for some communities, the conclusion of the gospel. Then I turned to chapter 21. And what you find in chapter 21 is a post-resurrection appearance in Galilee. Jesus on the shore, the disciples fishing, the miraculous catch, Peter's threefold restoration, the oblique reference to the beloved disciple. And it ends at chapter 21, verse 25, with another formal closing statement, a near echo of the one at the end of chapter 20. But there are also references to internal community dynamics, material that reads in its texture, like something added by a later hand for a specific pastoral purpose. The light in Cambridge that afternoon was the gray of a winter afternoon, even-toned and without shadow. The room was almost empty. Someone at a distant desk turned pages. I sat with that open facsimile longer than the consultation required. The book had been assembled from 2 moments, not deceptively, not dishonestly, but because a community needed something the earlier version did not provide. And the addition is not hidden. The seam is there in the text. for anyone who reads slowly enough. Raymond Brown, in his 1979 work on the Johannine community, reconstructed the history of the group that produced this gospel. A community of Jewish Christians, probably centered in a diaspora context. Ephesus is the traditional location, and it fits, who had been expelled from the synagogue and needed a theology that could sustain them in their separateness. A Jesus who was unambiguously divine, unambiguously cosmic, the Logos who had been there before Abraham, before creation. Not the Jesus of the messianic secret, moving quietly through Galilee and telling people to say nothing. The Jesus who says, "I am the resurrection and the life," and means it in the most absolute philosophical sense. They needed that, and John gave it to them. Now, Spinoza's method finally stated clearly. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus asks 3 questions about any biblical text: who wrote it, for whom, and when. Applied to John's Gospel, the answers converge on a coherent picture. Written between 90 and 100 AD, most scholars place it here based on the maturity of its Christology, the aposynagogo's evidence, the absence of any reference to the temple destruction as a future event. Written in a Greek-speaking, philosophically sophisticated context, almost certainly diaspora, the use of logos language presupposes an audience for whom Stoic and Philonic vocabulary was familiar. Written for a community of Jewish Christians who had been expelled from the synagogue and needed a theological foundation for their identity as a distinct community, separate from the Judaism that had excluded them. When you hold all 3 answers together, the Gospel's distinctive choices stop being anomalies and start being arguments. The absence of parables, John's community communicated in a different register. The I am declarations, that community needed a Jesus who could stand against the synagogue authorities, who could speak with divine authority, who could not be dismissed as merely a teacher or a prophet. The prologue's logos theology, a direct address to Greek-educated Jewish Christians who needed to know that their faith was intellectually coherent within the philosophical framework they inhabited. The aposynagogo's references, the community's own trauma, folded into the narrative of Jesus' life, because that was how they made sense of their exile. And Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus as the trigger for the crucifixion, becomes the theological keystone of this architecture. John needed a resurrection before the resurrection. He needed to demonstrate that Jesus was the resurrection and the life. His own explicit claim in chapter 11, before the Easter event, validated it. Lazarus is the proof of concept, and the proof needed to be the thing that set the final events in motion, so that death and resurrection became structurally inseparable throughout the second half of the Gospel, not merely asserted at the end. The 4 Gospels are not 4 witnesses agreeing on the essentials with different emphases. They are 4 authors with 4 audiences and 4 purposes, 3 of them drawing on overlapping traditions, and 1 of them working from a significantly later, philosophically distinct community-specific context. John is the most theologically elaborated, the most philosophically sophisticated, and the most distant from the figure of the historical Jesus, as that figure can be reconstructed from the earliest sources. I want to be careful about what I am claiming and what I am not. I am not claiming that John is a forgery or that it is valueless. I am not claiming that the experience of reading John and finding something true and sustaining in it is an illusion. Both of those claims would be obviously wrong. What I am claiming is that the relationship between John and the Synoptics is not one of harmonious complementarity. It is one of theological revision. John does not add to what Matthew, Mark, and Luke said. In significant structural ways, it replaces them. It removes their trigger event for the crucifixion and substitutes its own. It removes their crucifixion chronology and substitutes its own. It removes their teaching style and substitutes its own. It removes their portrait of a Jesus who avoids self-proclamation and substitutes a Jesus who announces his divine identity in the first person. What I find difficult, and I have thought about this for a long time, longer than I have thought about most things, is not that John is different. It is that for 19 centuries, people have been told it is the same. Right. This is where we end. I want to leave you with something that is not a conclusion, because I think the evidence genuinely does not permit an easy conclusion. It permits a harder, more interesting one. Consider the question this way. What makes a gospel true? Two possible answers have been available throughout this conversation. 1. Historical accuracy. A gospel is true if it accurately records what happened, what Jesus said, what he did, in what sequence, on what dates. By this measure, the contradictions between John and the Synoptics are a serious problem, because they cannot all be historically accurate simultaneously. But there is another answer. A gospel is true if it sustains a community